They thought she was invisible. A little black girl, no more than 7, scarred and trembling in the snow, digging through a stranger's mailbox on Christmas Eve. No coat, no safety, just a torn letter and a hope the world had already crushed. And no one cared until he stepped outside. A billionaire widower who'd lost everything, and a German shepherd whose nose had never forgotten what danger smelled like. Together, they walked into a storm that would change both their lives forever. What happened next will break your heart and heal it all at once. Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments. And if you believe no child should be forgotten, if you believe dogs carry a loyalty deeper than blood, hit that subscribe button, because this story is one you will never forget. The city of Portland, Maine lay wrapped in a heavy quilt of December snow. The Atlantic wind swept inland, carrying with it the sting of salt and cold, filling the narrow streets with a muffled silence that only winter can deliver. Street lamps burned halos through the falling flakes, and the houses along the block seemed like weary soldiers, their roofs bowed beneath white burdens. Christmas lights flickered faintly on porches, a fragile defiance against the darkness. At the far end of Hawthorne Street, a large stone house stood apart from the rest. 3 stories tall, slate roof trimmed with icicles, and a gate that hummed with quiet wealth. It belonged to Elliot Monroe, age 42. Elliot was a widower, his wife Harper gone 3 years now. Once the world had called him brilliant, a venture capitalist who built empires out of ideas. His salt and pepper hair was cropped neatly, his jawline still sharp but softened by grief. He wore cashmere coats and leather shoes that seemed too polished for a man who rarely left his own property. His neighbors whispered that Elliot's fortune had bought him everything except peace, and that loss had carved his broad shoulders into something perpetually hunched. Inside the house, marble counters gleamed, and a fire roared in the hearth like a painting come alive. But the man who owned it stood most nights on the porch, coat pulled tight, gazing into the dark as if listening for something he could never name. That night, it was not Elliot who first sensed what was wrong. It was Ranger. Ranger was a German shepherd, male, 9 years old. His coat was black and tan, thick and roughened by age, with a faint scar along his right flank, a mark from years ago when he had worked in search and rescue in New Hampshire's mountains. His amber eyes, sharp as polished amber stone, carried both weariness and vigilance. He was tall, muscular still, though his ribs showed when the light struck from the wrong angle. Ranger had been trained to save the lost, and though time had dimmed his speed, it had not dimmed his instinct. He had earned his name not from Elliot, but from Harper. On their second wedding anniversary, Elliot and Harper had gone hiking in the White Mountains. A boy, barely 10, had slipped from the trail and tumbled into a ravine. Harper, without hesitation, had scrambled down the slope while Elliot called emergency services. Their young German shepherd puppy, then barely a year old, bounded after her and sat watch at the boy's side, guarding him until the rescue team arrived. Harper had laughed through tears that day and said, "He's a ranger, Elliot, not just a dog, a guardian." The name stayed, and even after Harper's passing, Elliot whispered it sometimes at night, as if speaking her memory through the animal she had christened. That evening, Ranger stirred from his rug by the fire, ears pricking toward the door. He caught it, fear threaded through damp wool and the metallic trace of an old wound. He padded across the marble floor, nails clicking softly, and whined. Elliot followed his gaze. "What is it, boy?" The shepherd growled low, the sound like distant thunder, and trotted to the porch. Elliot sighed, slipped into his long coat, and opened the door. Snow lashed his face as he stepped into the cold. At first he thought the porch was empty. Then he saw her. A small figure stood at his gate, half hidden beneath the swirl of snow. A girl, perhaps 7. Her hand was buried inside his mailbox as though she were foraging for firewood. She turned, startled, eyes wide, dark as pools reflecting streetlight. Her skin was a rich brown, but her cheeks were pale with cold, and a jagged red scar ran from her ear to her jaw. Her coat was not a coat at all, but a patchwork of stitched blankets, and her boots sagged, clearly too large, stuffed with newspaper for padding. This was Amara Bell. Amara was small and thin, her hair in tight braids that had begun to unravel. Life had etched lines of fear far too old for her age across her expression. She was shy, defensive by instinct, yet in her wide eyes burned a stubborn flicker, the kind of resilience only children abandoned too soon can muster. She had lived with her grandmother, Lila Bell, until fate took Lila away. Since then, Amara had moved through hands and places like a parcel nobody wanted, learning silence because silence kept her safer than speech. The scar on her face whispered of that silence. Elliot's voice cut the snowy stillness. "Hey, what are you doing?" The girl froze. Ranger stood beside Elliot now, hackles half raised, nose twitching. But instead of recoiling, Amara let her hand remain inside the mailbox, eyes locked on Elliot's. "I'm looking for a letter," she said, voice trembling yet steady. Elliot frowned. "A letter?" She pulled her hand out. In it was a crumpled envelope, the ink smudged with old tears and new snow. "My grandma sent it here a long time ago. I thought maybe this time it would come back." Elliot's chest tightened. He glanced at the polished brass numbers on his gate, then at the child shivering before him. "That's not how mail works, kid." Amara's lips pressed thin. Her breath fogged in the icy air. "The man in this house could help me." Something cold rippled down Elliot's spine. He stepped closer, the snow crunching under his boots. She looked younger now, up close. Her teeth chattered. And then Elliot noticed the scar again, raw and cruel. "What happened to your face?" he asked gently. She hesitated, then whispered, "He said I talked too much." Ranger growled, a low, steady warning. He stepped between Elliot and the girl, nose brushing her blanket coat, breath warm against her shaking hands. For the first time, Amara did not flinch. She let her fingers rest against the shepherd's fur. Ranger leaned in, as if sealing a pact. Elliot's fists clenched in his coat pockets. Behind him was warmth, leather chairs, and a fire burning like art. Before him was a child, ragged and hurt, who spoke of a grandmother's letter as if it were a lifeline. The girl stepped forward and pressed the envelope into his hand. "Give it back to her," she said. "To the headstone. No songs, just a hole." He staggered, momentarily robbed of words. "What's your name?" "Amara." "Where do you live, Amara?" She shook her head. "Nowhere. I left." The snow thickened, flakes catching in her hair. She turned, small figure fading toward the street lamp glow. "You can't just walk away in a blizzard," Elliot called. "I've done worse," she replied, not looking back. Elliot stared after her, envelope crumpled in his gloved hand. Ranger barked once, sharp, commanding, amber eyes locked on him. Elliot sighed. "All right, boy, we don't let ghosts walk alone." He hurried after her. Ranger padded beside Amara, shoulder brushing her knee like a silent escort. The girl's trembling eased slightly. When Ranger dropped one of his old chew toys shaped like a waffle into her hand, she blinked, then giggled softly. It was the first sound of laughter to touch the night. For Elliot, it felt like a door long locked had cracked open again. The fire crackled with a restless patience, tossing sparks like tiny messengers into the chimney throat, while the storm outside drummed its steady fingers across the roof. Elliot Monroe sat in his high-backed leather chair, the weight of the crumpled envelope pressing into his palm. Across from him, Amara Bell crouched on the hearthrug, knees drawn to her chest. Ranger lay at her side, head resting on his paws, the slow rise and fall of his chest a counterpoint to the child's shivers. Elliot unfolded the paper carefully, its edges brittle, its handwriting uneven but steady, the kind born of someone who had lived through too much and refused to give in. The letter was addressed to Harper Monroe, his late wife, gone now 3 winters. He had never met its writer, Lila Bell, Amara's grandmother, but her words uncoiled across the page like threads binding strangers into family. "Harper, you once told me kindness does not vanish with time. I believed you when you said debts of mercy must be paid forward. You saved my Ruth, and so one day, perhaps my blood will stand in front of your door, needing something only you can give. If that day comes, I pray you will not turn her away." Elliot's breath hitched. He remembered. 2008, a stretch of I-295 gleaming slick with rain. Harper had been driving home from a lecture when a truck skidded and spun. They told him later her seatbelt jammed. She would have drowned in the marshy ditch if not for the stranger who tore the door open. That stranger was Lila. Harper, drenched and shaking, had whispered to him that night, "One day, Elliot, we'll have to give this back. That's how grace works." Now the letter lay in his hands, written years later by the same woman, and outside that circle of firelight sat her granddaughter, thin as kindling, scarred and silent. Amara broke the quiet. "Did you know her? My grandma?" Elliot shook his head slowly. "No, but my wife did, and she spoke of her with gratitude." Amara's eyes searched him, as if measuring truth against survival instinct. Then she shifted, pulling something from the pocket of her patched blanket coat, a stub of pencil and a folded page torn from an old catalog. She laid it flat on the rug and began sketching. Her strokes were quick but certain, and soon a small house appeared. 2 windows, smoke curling from a chimney, a door just wide enough for Hope to walk through. She added 2 figures in the window, one tall, one short, both smiling. Ranger lifted his head and gave a soft woof. Amara giggled faintly and pressed the page toward Elliot. That's what it should look like. Warm. Not big like this house. Just safe. Elliot stared at the drawing, then back at her. His heart, numb for years, stirred painfully. He turned toward the mantel. There, tucked among framed photographs, was one taken in 2008. Harper laughing under strings of Christmas lights, her arm wrapped around an older black woman with silver hair, Lila Bell. Elliot had never noticed it before. Not really. But now, in the firelight, the image glowed. For a moment, grief and gratitude tangled inside him until he could not tell which was which. The wind rattled the windows, and the old grandfather clock in the corner ticked louder, as though marking the pulse of a new promise. Amara, exhausted, leaned against Ranger. The shepherd shifted, curling his body around hers, offering the warmth of fur and breath. She sighed, eyelids heavy, but not before whispering, "Grandma used to say if you draw something enough times, maybe it becomes real." Elliot folded the letter gently and set it beside the photograph. He looked at Amara's drawing one more time. The 2 smiling figures in the window seemed to watch him, waiting. He whispered into the room, not sure if he was speaking to Harper, to Lila, or to himself. "I won't turn her away." Ranger's ears flicked at the sound, and in the silence that followed, a knot inside the house eased just slightly, as if stone and wood alike were breathing again. The storm had not let up by morning. Instead, it had thickened, burying cars to their wheel wells and weighing down the branches of the maples like stooped elders in the yard. Elliot Monroe rose early, though early was meaningless in the dim gray of a winter storm. He brewed coffee in silence, his eyes glancing often at the girl asleep on the couch, curled in Ranger's flank as if the shepherd were a furnace of fur. Amara Bell slept deeply, her scarred face softened, her small fists no longer clenched but open, resting on the blanket Elliot had placed over her. Ranger kept one eye half open, amber gleam watchful, his tail thumping once when Elliot passed. At 8:45 a.m., the sound came, 3 measured knocks against the heavy oak door. Not hurried, not hesitant firm, deliberate. Elliot frowned. Few people visited unannounced, and fewer still during a storm like this. Ranger's ears snapped upright. He padded across the room, nose low, body taut, his growl low but restrained. Elliot opened the door. A man stood there in a gray overcoat dusted white at the shoulders. He was tall, in his late 30s, his blonde-brown hair cut short, a few strands already silver at the temples. His tie was askew, as though he had dressed in a hurry, but his steel-blue eyes were steady and direct. This was Detective Evan Cole, 38, Portland Police Department. He was known among his colleagues for 2 things: meticulous honesty and a relentless dislike of paperwork. His face bore lines not just of stress, but of compassion, the kind carved into someone who had seen too much suffering yet refused to harden completely. Years earlier, he had lost his younger sister to an abusive foster placement, a tragedy that had shaped his quiet but fierce determination to investigate every case involving vulnerable children. "Mr. Monroe?" His voice was low, respectful but clipped, the cadence of a man who measured every word. Elliot nodded cautiously. "Yes, Detective?" "I'd like to ask a few questions," Cole said, stepping inside when Elliot moved aside. He scanned the room once, his gaze resting a moment on Amara, who stirred awake under Ranger's protective bulk. Something softened in his expression, but his jaw remained set. "We received notice that a minor has turned up here. Records suggest she was part of several emergency transfers." He glanced back to Elliot. "The kind that are supposed to be temporary but happen too often." Elliot gestured toward the fire. "She showed up on my doorstep last night. I didn't invite the system to send her. She just came." Cole's eyes narrowed, though not with suspicion, more with the weight of understanding. He tugged at his tie, loosened it slightly, and pulled out a slim notepad. Last night, our station logged a report of a black SUV circling neighborhoods near the river. No plates identified. Do you have cameras? Elliot exhaled. Yes, I checked the feed. Around 2:13 a.m., an SUV stopped at my gate. Didn't buzz, just idled, then pulled away. Cole wrote quickly, then crouched near Ranger, who had returned to sniffing the floor mat and the air near the door. The shepherd sneezed, then pressed his nose hard into the bottom crack of the door. Cole raised a brow. What's he doing? He remembers smells, Elliot answered. He used to work search and rescue. He catalogs them. Cole leaned down, careful not to crowd the dog. Ranger sniffed again, then whined, pawing once at the floorboard. Elliot caught the scent too sharp, chemical, unpleasant. Rubber, Cole muttered. And cologne, cheap kind. He leaned closer, eyes narrowing. Menthol, peppermint cigarettes. Amara had sat up now, rubbing her eyes. That's him, she said softly. Both men turned. The one who moved me. He always smelled like that. Cold rubber and candy smoke. Cole straightened. His hand gripped the notepad so hard it bent. Thank you, Amara. His tone softened with the care of someone who had spent years learning how not to frighten a child already half broken. From the window, Elliot noticed movement in the yard. Their neighbor, Mrs. Margaret O'Rourke, trudged along her shoveled path, wrapped in a green parka, knit cap pulled low. She was in her late 60s, sharp-tongued but good-hearted, a widow who filled her loneliness by keeping watch over the street like a hawk. She banged on her fence with a broom. "Elliot!" she called, voice carrying even through the snow. "Which fool is dousing my hedges in dollar store cologne? The whole street stinks like a dance hall in 1979. She sneezed loudly, shaking her head. "My poor roses will never forgive it." Ranger sneezed 3 times in quick succession, making Amara laugh. Elliot opened the side door and called back. "We'll check the cameras, Mrs. O'Rourke." She sniffed, muttering, "Check them fast. I'll bake you cookies if you find the scoundrel." Then she disappeared into her house, slamming the door against the storm. Cole allowed himself the faintest smile. She's right about the cologne. He turned back to Elliot. "Mr. Monroe, I'll need access to your footage, and I'll station a car at the corner for the next few nights. Whoever that was, he's not circling out of curiosity." Amara hugged Ranger tightly. Her voice trembled. "He'll come back. He always does." Cole crouched to her level, his steel blue eyes softening. "Not if we're ready for him. And now he's got more than just you to face." He glanced toward Ranger, who bared his teeth in silent agreement. Elliot closed his fist around Lila's letter, still tucked in his pocket. He looked at the detective, then at Amara, then at the dog who had been Harper's legacy. Something inside him, long dormant, tightened into resolve. Then we'll be ready. The storm howled louder outside, but inside the house, the fire burned brighter, as if daring the dark to try again. The morning after Detective Evan Cole's visit, the storm finally thinned into a soft gray drizzle of snow. Portland's back cove was sheathed in white, the tidal flats hidden beneath a thick crust that groaned faintly with the shifting tide. Elliot Monroe stood with his collar turned up, his breath hanging in the air like pale smoke. Beside him, Ranger moved deliberately, head low, nostrils quivering as he sifted through layers of scent no human could parse. His paws sank deep into the snow, but his body carried an energy that seemed to erase his age. Retirement, Elliot thought, was a word on paper. In Ranger's bones there was still duty. Ranger halted near the bend of the cove where the snow had been churned, compacted by tires. He lowered his head, nose sweeping side to side, tail stiff. A sharp growl rumbled from his throat. Elliot crouched, brushing his glove across the tracks. "SUV," he murmured. Cole knelt beside him, pulling out a small evidence bag, collecting a fragment of rubber that had split from a tread. Cole, with his tie once again imperfectly knotted, scribbled in his pad. "Smells?" he asked, glancing toward Ranger. Elliot answered quietly. "He's fixated. It's something he recognizes." The shepherd sneezed once, then pressed his nose hard into a snowbank and pulled back with a violent shake of his head. Elliot inhaled. Even he caught it now solvent, acrid and chemical, and faintly sweet with peppermint smoke. Cole's jaw tightened. Trent Doss. His tone made the name heavy, as though it had been waiting to surface. Elliot frowned. Who? Cole rose, brushing snow from his knees. Freelance recovery agent. Calls himself that anyway. Officially, he repossesses cars, trailers, boats. Unofficially, he retrieves children for certain private agencies when placements fall through. They call him quick, efficient. That means he doesn't ask questions about bruises or paperwork. Amara, bundled in one of Elliot's coats that swallowed her frame, stood a few steps back with a hand buried in Ranger's fur. Her eyes widened at the name. I know him, she whispered. The one who smelled like candy smoke. He said if I ever talked again, he'd come back. Ranger leaned harder into her side, tail pressing against her legs as if to anchor her. Elliot's face hardened. And those agencies hire him? Cole nodded grimly. Paid per head. The system doesn't condone it, but loopholes exist. DOS thrives in loopholes. He folded the evidence bag and slipped it into his coat. We'll track him, but money leaves tracks too. Inside Elliot's home, that other hunt had already begun. Lacey Tran, 34, sat at the long oak table in the study, surrounded by a half-dozen laptops and stacks of paper that looked less like accounting files and more like debris after a storm. Lacey had been Elliot's foundation accountant for nearly a decade, small in stature, sharp-eyed, with sleek black hair always pinned back and glasses that slid down her nose. She hated weak coffee with a passion that bordered on religion. The kitchen counter was now dominated by a gleaming espresso machine she had dragged in herself. Her personality was quiet but unyielding, the kind of woman who, when ignored in meetings, repeated herself until every syllable was acknowledged. Her father, once a factory worker, had lost his job to corruption in a local union, and from that moment, Lacey's crusade against financial deception had been carved into her like stone. She didn't raise her voice, but her spreadsheets were weapons sharper than knives. Now, fueled by double espressos, she clicked through filings on Northlight Bridges, a non-profit that proclaimed itself a sanctuary for children who need placement when others turn them away. Its brochures were printed on thick, glossy paper, showing smiling children in sweaters under autumn trees. But numbers don't lie, and Lacey's fingers danced through tax records, tracing transfers to shell corporations that seemed to exist for only months at a time. Elliot, she called as he stepped in with Cole and Amara still trailing snow. You need to see this. She turned her laptop toward them. On the screen, a web of names and accounts sprawled across a digital map. Northlight Bridges at the center, with threads pulling into half a dozen LLCs, each dissolved within a year, each transferring funds offshore. Where's it end up? Cole asked, leaning close. Wyoming, Nevada, the Caymans, Lacey replied crisply. But the pattern's the same. Large donations from private donors funnel into Northlight, then are siphoned into these shells. The language suggests service contracts. She tapped one document. Payments labeled Rapid Placement Incentives. Amara tilted her head. What's that mean? Lacey softened her tone, glancing at the girl. It means they get money for moving kids too quickly, faster than anyone should. Amara's eyes fell to the rug. Ranger pressed his nose to her hand, forcing it upward until she scratched behind his ears. The dog's steady gaze said what Elliot could not. You're not a number. Elliot's jaw clenched. And who's the donor? Lacey clicked again. A name surfaced at the end of several trails. Marcus Lawton. Cole's brows furrowed. Industrialist. Owns shipping lines down the coast. Donates to half the city's charities. He's untouchable on paper. Lacey pushed her glasses up. On paper is my territory. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, softer this time, as though the storm itself were listening. Elliot stood at the window, the letter from Lila Bell still folded in his pocket, Amara sketching quietly at the table with Ranger curled protectively against her chair. The child drew another house, this one sturdier than before, a chimney taller, the figures inside holding hands. Cole spoke low, almost to himself. Doss brings them in. Lawton funds the machine. Northlight gives them cover. We cut one thread, the others unravel. Elliot turned back, voice steady. Then we'll cut them all. And Ranger, hearing his tone, gave a short, decisive bark, tail sweeping the floor as though to seal the pact. By dusk, the storm had quieted into a brittle silence, the kind that amplifies every crunch of boot over ice and every creak of wood. Elliot Monroe walked the perimeter once more, scarf tight around his throat, his breath clouding in the sharp air. Inside the house, the fire cast long shadows on the walls, and Amara Bell sat cross-legged at the coffee table, her small hands busy with crayons Elliot had found in a forgotten drawer. Ranger lay nearby, head on paws but eyes fixed toward the back door as if he already knew what would come. The first sound was faint, the scrape of metal against the lock of the mudroom door. Ranger's ears shot up. He rose in a single, fluid motion, muscles tightening beneath his black and tan coat, and then the growl came, low and steady. Elliot froze for half a second before he caught the second sound, a branch snapping near the tree line, too deliberate to be wind. "Someone's here," Elliot whispered, but Ranger was already moving. He thundered into the door with a force that rattled the frame, the impact booming like winter thunder rolling across frozen ground. On the porch outside, the shadowed figure cursed, stumbling back. Elliot glimpsed him through the side glass, tall, gloved hands, face hidden beneath a knit cap pulled low. A second figure darted along the pines bordering the yard. The intruders had split one at the lock, one circling wide. Amara cried out. Ranger barked with feral authority, the kind that echoed down to bone. The man at the door fled, slipping into the snow. The second tried to cut across the yard, but the ice betrayed him. His boots skidded, and in an instant Ranger was upon him, a streak of muscle and fury. The shepherd slammed into the man's side, knocking him down, his teeth bared inches from the man's throat. The growl that followed was not frantic but purposeful, the sound of judgment made flesh. Headlights swung into the drive, tires sliding on the ice. Detective Evan Cole's cruiser slewed sideways before righting itself, red and blue lights flashing against the snowbanks. Cole leapt out, weapon drawn but steady. His overcoat flapped in the wind, his steel blue eyes burning with focus. "Ranger, hold!" Elliot shouted, breath ragged. Ranger obeyed, though his stance remained stiff, eyes locked on the intruder now pinned by fear as much as ice. Cole moved fast, pressing the man to the ground, cuffing him in seconds. Inside, Amara clutched the paper she had been drawing on. Two figures stood back to back beneath a small sun, their shoulders touching, a simple crayon world where danger could not breach. She held it to her chest, whispering, "Stronger like this." Elliot entered, snow clinging to his coat. He met her gaze and nodded. "Yes, stronger." His eyes flicked toward Ranger, who stood at the doorway, chest heaving, tail still rigid. "Some promises are kept with shoulders," Elliot said quietly, "and some with teeth." From the yard came a sharp, familiar voice. "Monroe!" It was Mrs. Margaret O'Rourke, trudging down her walk with surprising speed for a woman in her late 60s. She wore her parka half-zipped, gray hair escaping from beneath her knit hat, cheeks flushed pink with cold. In her hands she carried a dented metal bucket. She stopped at the fence and hurled it over with more force than Elliot expected. The bucket hit the snow with a dull clang, spilling sand and gravel. "Take it!" she barked. "Spread it before one of those idiots sues you for slipping. Lord knows I don't want to see police cars sliding into my begonias come spring." Her sharp eyes darted toward the cuffed man in Cole's custody. "And for heaven's sake, if you're going to have trouble at your doorstep, at least make them fall on something softer than ice." Ranger sneezed once, shaking his head, and padded to the bucket as if inspecting her work. Cole gave a short laugh despite himself. "Your neighbor has a way with timing." "Timing and opinions," Elliot muttered, though a smile tugged at his lips. Cole straightened, hauling the cuffed intruder to his feet. Up close, the man was wiry, maybe mid-30s, with gaunt cheeks, eyes that darted like a trapped animal's. His cheap coat smelled faintly of peppermint and smoke. Cole's mouth tightened. Not Doss. A runner. But maybe he'll talk. He shoved the man into the back of the cruiser, slamming the door. Amara, still holding her drawing, looked at Elliot. "They'll come again, won't they?" He knelt before her, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Yes. But next time, we'll be ready sooner, and we'll always stand back to back." Ranger pushed his head into Amara's lap, the rumble of his breath steady, grounding. She stroked his ears, calmer now. Outside, Cole called, "I'll take him in. Patrol will circle every hour tonight. But watch your doors, Monroe. These men aren't finished." His gaze flicked toward the girl, softer now. "Neither are we." As the cruiser pulled away, Elliot shut the heavy oak door. The latch clicked into place. For a moment, only the fire spoke, crackling against the silence. Then Amara carefully laid her drawing on the mantel beside Lila Bell's letter and the photograph of Harper. Elliot stared at the three items together, letter, photo, child's drawing, past, loss, and a fragile hope. Ranger curled at the threshold, body stretched wide, his scar catching the firelight. His eyes never left the door that had not opened. The snow had not melted, but the silence around Elliot Monroe's home had changed. It no longer felt like a place waiting for footsteps in the dark. It felt like a place watching, awake, its windows holding breath. Elliot paced the study with Lila Bell's letter folded in his pocket, Amara Bell asleep upstairs in the guest room, and Ranger lying across the threshold like a drawn line no intruder dared cross. 2 days later, Elliot decided silence was no longer enough. He began with words on a page. The op-ed ran in the Portland Herald, its title simple: "Kindness cannot be counted in quotas." In it, Elliot wrote of debts of mercy, of a grandmother named Lila who once saved his wife's life, and of a child who had walked through snow carrying nothing but scars and a crumpled envelope. He named no agencies directly, but he spoke of numbers treated like children and children treated like numbers. When the paper hit newsstands, the response came like a tide. Within hours, his office was overwhelmed by emails, calls, handwritten letters. Children from across Maine, from as far as Oregon and Texas, sent crayon drawings, stick figures holding hands, houses with windows glowing yellow, dogs with tails bigger than their bodies. Elliot stacked them by the fireplace, unable to throw a single one away. Detective Evan Cole pushed the fight further. In the courthouse, his steel blue eyes burned with quiet fire as he presented testimony before a grand jury. He laid out the pattern of rapid placements, the gaps in records, the suspicious payouts. He cited the night at Elliot's gate, the black SUV, the peppermint-scented intruders. His tie was still crooked, as always, but his words landed like nails driven straight. He was not eloquent, he was precise, and precision drew blood. Meanwhile, Ranger claimed the porch as his battlefield. Each evening he performed his own patrol, circling the house with the silent authority of one who had memorized every hinge, every latch, every creak of the old timbers. To Elliot, it looked like ritual. To Ranger, it was math. 1 window, 2 locks, 3 heartbeats sleeping by the fire. Nothing could alter that equation without his consent. His age showed in his stiff joints, but he carried himself with a gravity that made even shadows hesitate. As the story spread, Northlight Bridges issued a statement. A man in a pressed suit, his hair parted so sharply it looked cut by a blade, appeared on television declaring, "All our placements follow proper procedure. We are a beacon of hope." His name was Daniel Keene, the nonprofit's public relations director. He was 40, thin, always impeccably dressed, with the hollow eyes of someone who cared less for truth than for narrative. Keene had made his career spinning disasters into palatable sound bites for charities with dark underbellies. But Elliot's words had already reached further than Keene's. The public wasn't interested in procedures. They were interested in the image of a small girl standing in snow with a letter to no one and a shepherd with eyes like fire watching over her. At night, Elliot found Amara in the kitchen with a pocket knife too large for her hands. Alarmed at first, he almost scolded her, but then he saw what she was doing. She had a scrap of wood, shaved smooth on one side, and she was carving with slow, deliberate strokes. She looked up, guilty at being caught, then held it out. On the surface was a single letter, R. "For him," she whispered, glancing at Ranger, who cocked his head as if curious. "So he remembers he's real, not just a story." Elliot swallowed hard. He helped her drill a tiny hole at the top, and together they threaded a bit of cord through. Amara tied it around Ranger's collar, the wooden tag bumping against his chest. Ranger sniffed it once, then wagged his tail with unusual vigor, thumping it against a chair leg. He wore the letter like a medal, prouder than Elliot had ever seen him wear the official Sayar badge from years before. "I think he likes it more than the shiny ones," Amara said with a small smile. "He does," Elliot admitted, and silently he thought, "So do I." The attention from the public did not go unnoticed by those at the center of the storm. Elliot's accountant, Lacey Tran, continued digging, her eyes red from nights without sleep, her desk crowded with espresso cups. She traced the money trail back to a name she and Cole had already suspected. Marcus Lawton, shipping magnate, patron of the arts, donor to hospitals. He appeared in photographs beside governors and bishops, his broad shoulders draped in bespoke suits, his white hair combed into waves like a portrait meant for a history book. His smile was the kind that seemed generous until one looked at his eyes, which were gray, calculating, never smiling with the mouth above them. In public, Lawton was silent on the matter. Reporters called, cameras gathered at his gated estate, but the magnate never emerged. His silence was louder than Keene's denials. Inside Elliot's home, however, silence was no longer emptiness. It was a language. It was the way Ranger thumped his tail each night after patrol, the way Amara added one more drawing to the growing stack, the way Elliot pressed his palm to the mantel beside Lila's letter and Harper's photograph as though asking for strength. One evening, as the fire burned low, Elliot turned to Evan. "Do you ever feel like the house itself is listening?" Evan, still in his crooked tie, glanced at the dark beams overhead. "I feel like it's speaking," he answered simply. Ranger sighed, the wooden tag tapping softly against the floor, as though in agreement. The Portland harbor wore its winter-like jewelry, every piling wrapped in ice, every rope stiff as a frozen vein, the gray water pushing against the docks with a hollow groan. The warehouses along the pier loomed like sleeping beasts, their corrugated metal walls streaked with rust and snow. It was here, at the edge of the city's pulse, that Detective Evan Cole led Elliot Monroe and Ranger, the German shepherd whose every step seemed to hum with tension. Evan moved cautiously, his breath misting the night air. His crooked tie had been replaced with a thick navy scarf, but his sharp eyes remained the same, scanning every shadow. He hated the height of the scaffolding that framed the warehouse, and as he glanced at the iron stairs leading up to a rusted mezzanine, his stomach tightened. He muttered under his breath, "Don't look down, don't look down." Ranger, padding below, paused mid-step and looked up with a tilt of his head, then deliberately leaned over the pier's edge, peering into the icy black water before snorting as if unimpressed. Elliot smirked despite the tension. "He's mocking you," he whispered. Evan glared, but kept climbing. At the base of the warehouse, Ranger froze. His nose pressed into the seam of the heavy sliding door, nostrils flaring. He sneezed once, then growled deep. Elliot crouched beside him. The smell was faint but unmistakable. Solvent, cold rubber, and peppermint smoke. The cocktail of scents that had followed Amara like a curse. Evan tested the padlock. It was stiff with rust but recently oiled. He took out a crowbar from his satchel, wedged it in, and with a grunt popped the lock free. Ranger surged forward, nose low, body coiled like a spring. Inside, the warehouse was colder than the air outside. Dust motes swirled in the thin light leaking through broken windows. Against the far wall, crates were stacked in uneven rows. On a makeshift desk lay folders, burner phones, and a ledger so thick it could have been mistaken for a census. Elliot's eyes darted across the pages. Dates, initials, payments, destinations. It was all there, written in a cruel shorthand. Children as transactions. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps. From the shadows at the far end, a man burst forward. He was lean, mid-40s, his face gaunt, cheekbones sharp as blades. His hair was cut short, uneven, as if hacked by his own hand. His coat was grimy, reeking of menthol and smoke. This was Trent Doss, the so-called recovery agent. His eyes, small and fever-bright, locked on the intruders with feral rage. "You shouldn't be here," he snarled, voice cracked from cigarettes and cold air. Evan raised his gun. "Portland PD, don't move." But Doss did. He lunged with surprising speed, pulling a rusted knife from his belt. For a split second, Elliot thought the blade might reach Evan's arm. But Ranger was faster. He leapt, his body an arc of muscle and intent, colliding with Doss midair. The man crashed backward, the knife clattering across the floor. Ranger stood over him, teeth bared, growl vibrating through the warehouse like a warning bell. Elliot rushed to Evan's side. Cole's breath was steady, his weapon still trained, but his hands trembled faintly from the adrenaline. He cuffed Doss with swift efficiency. "Not so fast this time," he muttered. As the echoes of the struggle faded, Elliot flipped open the ledger again. His throat tightened as he traced the words, "Rapid Placement Incentives." Each entry corresponded to a payment, amounts that grew with each difficult child. He shoved the ledger toward Evan. "This is it. This is the spine." Meanwhile, back at Elliot's estate, Lacey Tran sat hunched over her laptop, a half-empty espresso beside her. Her eyes burned from sleepless nights, but victory glinted in her expression. She had been untangling shell corporations for hours, her fingers tapping with surgical rhythm. Each dissolved company led to another, but tonight one link cracked open. Northlight Bridges, M. Lawton Holdings, Lawton Maritime Charities. She clicked deeper, her screen glowing in the dim study. The language was coded, but the intent was plain. Payments per child, labeled as incentives for rapid transfer. Her lips pressed into a thin line. She whispered to herself, "So you bought them, Marcus. You bought their suffering." She printed the files, spread them across Elliot's desk, each page another nail in the coffin of the powerful. At the harbor, Cole dragged Doss to his feet. Up close, the man looked smaller, less threatening, his bravado stripped away by Ranger's teeth still glinting inches from his throat. "You think Lawton cares about you?" Cole asked, his tone sharp. "You're disposable. He'll cut you loose like the rest." Doss spat blood into the snow. "You don't understand. Without people like me, kids rot in shelters. I move them. I give them purpose." Elliot's eyes burned. "You sell them like cargo." Ranger growled louder, pressing his weight against Doss's legs until the man flinched. Evan shoved him toward the cruiser waiting outside. "Save your excuses. The ledger speaks louder than you." As they stepped into the bitter night, Elliot glanced at Ranger. The shepherd's wooden tag the carved R. Amara had tied days before knocked softly against his chest. Ranger looked up, amber eyes steady. Elliot whispered, "Good boy. You've given us the spine we needed." Back at the house, Amara sat waiting by the fire, sketchbook on her lap. She looked up as Elliot entered, snow dusting his coat. "Did you find him?" she asked, voice small but firm. Elliot knelt, pulling the ledger from his satchel. "We found the truth," he said. Amara nodded, then slid her drawing across the floor. It was of Ranger, mouth open in mid-leap, drawn bigger than the men he faced, his wooden tag shining like a medal. At the bottom she had scrawled in uneven letters, "He remembers." Elliot felt his throat tighten. The house seemed to hum with something new, not silence, not fear, but a voice, steady and clear, carried in wood and fire and the scratch of a pencil across paper. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and nervous sweat. Its marble steps, chipped at the edges by decades of boots, bore the weight of yet another story no one had planned to tell. Elliot Monroe stood tall in the hall, dressed in a dark navy suit that had not left its closet in years. Beside him, Amara Bell clutched his hand, the little wooden R tag on Ranger's collar knocking softly against her knuckles as she held tight. Ranger, regal even with his graying muzzle, sat calmly, his amber eyes sweeping the crowded benches like a watchman ensuring order. The case against Marcus Lawton was not a spectacle in the legal sense, no explosions of outrage, no theatrics. It was the slow bleeding of power. Lacey Tran's financial forensics spread across the prosecution's table in neat stacks, each page a scalpel. She sat quietly in the gallery, hair tied back, lips pressed thin, her glasses fogging faintly from the courthouse heat. It was her work that drew the line straight from Northlight Bridges to Lawton's charities. Lawton himself, 65, broad-shouldered even under the slump of shame, wore a tailored charcoal suit. His white hair gleamed like frost under the courtroom lights. But his eyes, usually sharp and calculating, had dulled into something closer to resignation. He had weathered scandals before, bought silence before. But paper and ink, when gathered with precision, become a blade sharper than wealth. The ledger recovered from the harbor, with Trent Doss's initials scrawled across entries, became the nail that sealed his fate. Doss, thinner now, shackled and pale, sat hunched at the witness stand. His face looked drained of fight, his cheekbones sharper still under fluorescent light. He confessed names, dates, places, each syllable falling like stones into water. He named handlers, drivers, those who took the money and kept the machine turning. His voice shook, but not with guilt, with the collapse of arrogance. For the first time he was not feared, merely pitied. When it came time for Amara to speak, the room shifted. She stepped up to the microphone, shoulders squared in Elliot's oversized cardigan. Her braids, freshly tied by Mrs. O'Rourke that morning, framed her face. The scar along her cheek caught the light, but her eyes, wide and brown, carried something brighter than fear. She leaned in, voice small but clear. "I am not a number," she said. "I like to draw maps. Ranger likes waffles." For a beat, silence. Then a ripple of laughter spread through the room, not mocking, but gentle, the kind of sound that reminded everyone present what innocence was supposed to feel like. Even the judge, a woman in her 60s with sharp cheekbones and spectacles balanced at the tip of her nose, allowed herself the briefest smile. Evan Cole testified next, recounting the night at Elliot's house when the door had not opened. His tie was still crooked, as if defying ceremony, but his voice carried weight. He spoke of the SUV at 2:13 a.m., the peppermint stench, the hands at the lock, and the German shepherd who had hit the door like thunder. He spoke not with flourish, but with the kind of conviction only loss can carve into a man. He did not mention his sister, gone years ago in the same system, but it lived between his words. By the end of the hearings, Marcus Lawton stood and admitted guilt, not because of a sudden surge of morality, but because the evidence was a net from which even his fortune could not cut him free. His voice was steady but hollow. "I plead guilty." The words carried no grandeur, only the dry sound of a tree finally falling. Days later, Elliot signed the papers that made him Amara's legal guardian. His signature, neat but trembling, sealed more than a contract, it sealed a promise. Amara stood beside him, clutching Ranger's wooden R tag, grinning wide for the first official photograph of her new life. Spring crept into Portland like an apology. The snow receded, crocuses poked through thawing soil, and the yard behind Elliot's stone house stirred with life. There, amid hammering and sawdust, a treehouse began to rise. It was not elegant. Elliot's hands were more suited to spreadsheets than wood, but Amara sketched designs with crayons, and he followed them like blueprints. Ranger supervised from below, occasionally barking when Elliot's ladder wobbled, as if reminding him of standards. By April, the house in the tree stood complete, a small platform with railings, a roof patched with shingles, and a ladder strong enough for little feet. Painted in uneven strokes of green and blue, it faced east, where the sun rose over the harbor. On its floor lay Amara's blanket and Ranger's chew toy shaped like a waffle. One morning, as dawn stretched across the yard, Ranger climbed the sloping ramp Elliot had built just for him. His paws, though stiff with age, carried him to the top. He lowered his body onto the wood, head resting on Amara's small legs. From that perch, they watched the first light bleed over Portland. It was not just a treehouse. It was a watchtower, a sanctuary, a promise made solid. Houses could learn warmth. People could learn courage. And dogs had always known loyalty. But sometimes, finally, they were allowed to rest. Later that week, the Portland Police Department hosted a small gathering on Elliot's lawn. Neighbors gathered, including Mrs. O'Rourke in her green parka, clutching a tray of oatmeal cookies. Evan Cole stood straighter than usual, his crooked tie replaced for once with a crisp navy one. An officer stepped forward carrying a velvet box. "For service beyond duty," the captain said, his mustache twitching with formality. "We recognize Ranger as honorary guardian of Portland." Inside the box gleamed a medal, a brass leaf engraved with the city's seal, and beneath it, a small enamel charm shaped like a waffle. Amara clapped so hard her palms reddened. Ranger wagged his tail, leaning into Elliot's leg, as the medal was fastened to his collar beside the wooden R. The crowd applauded, some with laughter, some with tears. Elliot bent low, his hand pressing the shepherd's scarred side. "You kept your promise, old friend," he whispered. Ranger closed his eyes, the morning sun warm on his face. At the end of this story, we are reminded of something greater than courts, papers, or even victories won in public. What saved Amara was not only evidence and law, but the miracle of love that refused to give up. Sometimes God works his wonders not in lightning or fire, but in the quiet loyalty of a dog, in the courage of a child who speaks, and in the heart of a man who finally chooses to stand. And that is where the lesson touches us all. Every day, in our own homes and streets, there are doors that do not open, children who feel invisible, and voices waiting to be heard. It may not look dramatic, it may feel small, but God turns small acts of courage into miracles. He asks us to carry kindness forward, the way Lila once told Harper, and the way Elliot kept his promise to Amara. If you believe children are never just numbers, if you believe loyalty is holy, and if you believe God still works miracles through ordinary lives, then share this story so others may feel it too. Leave your thoughts in the comments. Subscribe if you want to hear more stories that shine a light into the dark. And may God bless you wherever you are watching from. If your heart agrees with this message, write in the comments one simple word that carries so much power. Amen.